Hey guys, how's it going? This is BillyEatWorld, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favourite video game consoles, the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom as it was known in Japan, was Nintendo's second home console, released in Japan in 1990 and the USA in 1991. The PAL SNES and the Super Famicom looked very different from the NTSC SNES, which had a boxier shape and a different colour scheme, but internally they were more or less the same system. When it was released, it met stiff competition from the Sega Genesis, which had already been out for a year or two, which kicked off the 16-bit console wars. It also faced competition from the less successful TurboGrafx-16 and the Atari Jaguar. Previously to this, in the mid to late 80s, Nintendo had dominated the home console market with the NES. Competing consoles like the Sega Master System and the Atari 7800 found it difficult to make an impression on the market, especially in the USA. The biggest factor that contributed to this was the fact that Nintendo had agreements with many third-party developers to exclusively produce games for Nintendo consoles. From day one, the SNES was set to launch from a strong position, and despite Sega and Atari's best efforts to upgrade the Genesis and Jaguar, Nintendo would ultimately come out well ahead, selling 49 million SNES consoles worldwide. The key to the Super Nintendo's success was its abundance of great games. The SNES was well known for its great platformers like Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, and Donkey Kong Country, amazing RPGs like Final Fantasy, Earthbound, and Secret of Mana, and fighting and beat-em-up games like Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat, and Final Fight. Nintendo was able to regulate third-party games developed for the system with its Seal of Quality system. Every game had to pass Nintendo's Seal of Quality requirements, and the result was that the system not only featured some of the best games ever made, but arguably more great games than any other system. The trade-off to this regulation, though, was that some games which had a lot of violence were toned down for the Super Nintendo version. Games in the Mortal Kombat series had the blood recoloured to look like sweat, and many of the fatalities were either removed or altered. In terms of hardware, the Super Nintendo had some of the best graphics of the generation. The Super Nintendo was unique in that it was capable of pseudo 3D graphics using scaling. This effect, which was called Mode 7, was featured in games like Pilot Wings, Super Mario Kart, and F-Zero. Later on, with the introduction of the Super FX chip in games like Star Fox, the SNES was even capable of very basic 3D polygons. The Super Nintendo is best known for its 2D graphics though, which were both detailed and colourful. Many games on the Sega Genesis came close to looking as good as games on the SNES, but the SNES was undoubtedly a much more capable system than the Genesis in terms of graphics. The sound chip of the Super Nintendo was also a lot better than the sound chip of the Genesis, and many of the most memorable theme songs in video game history were first written for the SNES. Like the NES, the Super Nintendo's games also came on cartridge, but unlike its predecessor, it was a top-loading system and didn't have the issues that the NES had with loose pin connectors. Like all cartridge-based systems though, the SNES still had issues loading carts from time to time, but for the most part, both it and its games were durable and reliable. Even more than 20 years on, it's rare to find completely dead Super Nintendo consoles and carts, which makes collecting and gaming on the original hardware a viable option. The SNES also adapted the original NES controller design by smoothing out the edges, adding 2 more buttons on the front, and adding shoulder buttons. This basic layout is still used today on the Xbox One and PS4 controllers, with the exception of the triggers and analog sticks. As well as an RF output, the SNES was also the first Nintendo console to feature the standard AV connector, which would later be used on the N64 and GameCube. Although the SNES wasn't originally intended to be backwards compatible with the NES, third-party adapters like the Super 8 later on gave SNES owners this option. The Super Game Boy adapter was also available to play Game Boy games. While not as many as the NES had, there were a wide range of other peripherals available for the SNES, including the Super Scope, the SNES Advantage controller, and the SNES mouse. A CD add-on was also planned to be developed with Philips and Sony, but the deal eventually fell through with both Philips and Sony, and the project ended up being the catalyst for the development of the Sony PlayStation. In hindsight, if the success of the Sega Genesis and Atari Jaguar add-ons were anything to go by, it was probably a good thing that Nintendo didn't release a CD add-on for the SNES, because the consoles of the 16-bit era were just not capable of using CDs to their full potential. Midway through the 90s, the SNES was eventually superseded with the Nintendo 64, and a smaller and cheaper model was released in 1997 called the SNES Junior. The SNES was discontinued in North America in 1999, but was still being sold in Japan till as late as 2003. Although its games have dated considerably, many are still just as fun today as they were when they were released, and for those people who don't have an original Super Nintendo, various clone systems have been sold throughout the years, including portable SNES clones like the Super Boy. Many games were also ported to the Game Boy Advance, and a number of SNES games are also available for download on the Wii Virtual Console. Many people still have a lot of fond memories of the SNES, and as each generation re-releases and reimagines games of the 16-bit era, it's unlikely this is going to change anytime soon. The SNES is an important part of gaming history and a must-have for any video game collector or fan of 16-bit gaming. If for some reason you haven't already tried out the SNES, do yourself a favour and give it a go, because I guarantee you won't be disappointed. So anyway guys, that's it. Thanks a lot for watching, and if you like what you see, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. If you have a favourite SNES game, or if you have any fond memories of the console, please let me know in the comment section below. And also, if you have any suggestions of consoles or games you'd like me to take a look at in the future, let me know them as well. So until then, stay tuned and have a good one.